You're standing at the self-checkout at a discount grocery store, wearing a jacket with a torn cuff you've meant to fix for 2 years, sneakers with the soles starting to separate at the toe, and the woman behind you, maybe 60, watches you count out crumpled bills for a total of $11.40, and before you can finish, she reaches past you and taps her card on the reader, covering it. Waving off your protest with the specific, gentle firmness of someone who's decided this is happening whether you like it or not. "You take care of yourself," she says, patting your arm once, and walks off toward the parking lot before you can even finish saying thank you, and you stand there for a second, groceries in a bag, genuinely moved by the kindness of it, and also aware, in a way you don't say out loud to anyone, of the specific, strange gap between what just happened and what's actually true about your life. $34 million, spread across investments, 2 rental properties, and a stake in a company you sold 4 years ago that most people who know you casually still have no idea existed. You could have paid for that woman's entire week of groceries, her entire month, without a flicker of consequence to your own life, and instead she paid for yours, $12, out of genuine, uncomplicated kindness for a man she was certain needed it. You didn't lie to her. You didn't say a single false word. You just looked the way you always look, and the specific gap between how you look and what's actually true did the rest of the work entirely on its own. This is the part almost nobody explains honestly about looking broke while quietly being anything but. It's rarely a costume you're consciously wearing. Most days, it's just how you actually dress, unremarkably, out of habit built over decades, and the specific social consequences of that habit, the pity, the unsolicited help, the quiet underestimation, arrive whether you intend them to or not, and what you do with them afterward turns out to say more about you than the money ever could. You didn't build this look on purpose, not at first. You grew up genuinely poor, the specific, textured poor that teaches you to patch a jacket rather than replace it, to resole shoes twice before considering new ones, habits installed so early and so completely that they never fully left, even after the actual reason for them disappeared years ago. You remember the exact year the wardrobe habit stopped being necessity and quietly became identity instead, sometime around your 3rd year of real financial success, standing in a department store with money to spend and genuinely not knowing what you'd even buy differently, because the clothes you already owned worked fine, felt fine, and the idea of upgrading them for the sake of upgrading them struck you, even then, as a strange use of money that had never once solved the problem you actually had. Your business partner, Callum, tells you once, half joking, over drinks, that you dress like a man who's 3 months behind on rent, delivered with real affection but genuine confusion underneath it, because Callum came from money originally and has never once had to think about what his clothes signal to strangers, a luxury of never having to think about it at all that you notice, with some irony. You've simply inherited from the opposite direction, you don't think about it either, just for entirely different reasons. The habit that got installed by genuine poverty and the habit of simply not caring what strangers assume about you eventually converge into the exact same wardrobe, and almost nobody on the outside can tell which version they're actually looking at. The gap becomes a genuine social problem, not just an amusing anecdote. The year you go to your niece's college financial aid meeting with her, standing in for her own parents who couldn't take the day off work, and the aid counselor, a well-meaning woman working through a stack of appointments, glances at you, at your jacket with the torn cuff, and adjusts her entire approach before you've said a single word. She speaks slower than she does with other families you've noticed in the waiting room, uses simpler language when explaining loan terms, and at one point, gently, asks whether your niece has looked into all the hardship provisions, a specific phrase she delivers with the careful tact of someone trying not to embarrass a family she's already decided is struggling. Your niece glances at you, unsure whether to correct the assumption, and you let it ride for a moment, partly out of habit, partly because correcting it feels, in the moment, like it would require an explanation neither of you actually wants to give a stranger in a 15-minute appointment slot. You realize, walking out afterward, that the counselor's kindness was completely genuine, and also completely misdirected, built entirely on a read of your jacket rather than any actual information about your family's finances, and you understand, for the first time with real clarity, that this specific gap isn't just a funny story about a stranger at a grocery store. It actively shapes decisions, forms, tone, and advice in rooms where accuracy actually matters, and the cost of correcting it, every single time, adds up to more social friction than most people realize until they're the ones standing in the room. Looking broke doesn't just change how strangers treat you at checkout lines. It changes the actual substance of professional conversations, the specific advice you're given, the assumptions baked into every interaction, and correcting it, every single time, requires an explanation heavy enough that most people, most of the time, simply let the assumptions stand instead. Your dating life, back before you married your wife, ran directly into this gap more than once, and the story you tell fewest people, the one that actually changed how seriously you took the whole question, happened on a second date with a woman named Priyasha, years before you met your wife. You'd shown up in your usual clothes, unremarkable jacket, the same worn sneakers, and over dinner, a modest place you both genuinely liked, she asked, carefully, gently, whether you were doing okay financially, a question delivered with real warmth, the specific tone of someone testing whether a relationship might be heading somewhere that would require her to help carry a partner through hard times. You told her the truth, technically, that you were doing fine, better than fine actually, but you didn't say the number, partly out of the same old habit of never saying it to anyone, and you watched her nod, not quite believing you, filing your answer away as the kind of thing people say to protect their pride rather than the kind of thing people say because it's simply true. The relationship ended a few months later, for reasons that had little to do with money directly, but you remember, afterward, turning the whole situation over in your head, understanding for the first time that the gap between how you looked and what was actually true hadn't just generated a funny misunderstanding. It had quietly shaped an entire relationship's foundation, layering a specific kind of unspoken pity into every early conversation you'd had, a foundation you never got the chance to fully correct before the relationship ended on its own. The gap doesn't just cost you a grocery bill covered by a stranger. In close relationships, it can quietly install an entire dynamic of imagined struggle, one partner privately managing concern for a hardship that was never actually real, and unwinding that imagined dynamic, once it's taken root, turns out to be far harder than simply dressing differently from the start would have been. Your wife, Odalise, is the one who finally changes how you think about all of this, not by asking you to dress differently, but by asking you a single, direct question early in your relationship that neither the grocery store woman nor Priyasha had ever thought to ask. On your third date, over coffee, she looks at your jacket, genuinely curious rather than concerned, and asks, plainly, "Is that a look, or is that just what you actually own?" You laugh, surprised by the directness of it, and tell her the truth, that it's genuinely just what you own, that you've never really cared to change it, and that you've never once told anyone the actual size of your bank account on an early date, partly out of habit, partly out of a specific, old suspicion about what people do once they know. She tells you, that same conversation, something that reframes the whole issue for you permanently, that the problem was never really the jacket. It was the specific, quiet dishonesty of letting people build an entire emotional picture of you, pity, concern, imagined struggle, without ever correcting it, a form of omission that, however unintentional, still shapes how people feel and act around you in ways you're not actually choosing, just allowing to happen by default. You start, after that conversation, doing something you'd never done before, correcting the assumption plainly, gently, whenever it actually matters, whenever the misunderstanding would otherwise shape a real decision or a real relationship, while still keeping the actual jacket, the actual sneakers, the actual habits that never bothered you in the first place. The look stays. The silence around it, in situations where it actually costs someone something real, doesn't. The actual lesson was never, dress richer, or dress poorer. It was learning to separate the parts of the gap that were genuinely harmless, a stranger's small, well-meant kindness at a checkout line, from the parts that were quietly costing someone else something real, a misinformed financial aid conversation, an entire relationship built on a foundation of imagined hardship, and correcting only the second kind, deliberately, while letting the first kind simply be what it's always been. A small, sweet misunderstanding that costs nobody anything at all. The woman from the grocery store, you learn much later, entirely by accident, turns out to be a regular at the same store, and you see her again about a year after that first encounter, and this time, when she reaches for her card as you're checking out, you stop her, gently, the way Odalise taught you to, and tell her the truth, plainly, without embarrassment, that you're actually doing very well. That her kindness last year meant more to you than she could have known, but that she doesn't need to cover your groceries today. She looks at you for a long moment, processing this, and then laughs, genuinely delighted rather than embarrassed, and says something you didn't expect. Well, good. I've been telling my daughter about you for a year. She kept asking if you were doing okay. You tell her you are, more than okay, and thank her again for the kindness a year earlier, which you tell her honestly mattered to you regardless of the actual math behind it, and she pats your arm again, the same gesture as before, except this time it lands as something closer to friendship than pity, a small, genuine connection that survived the correction perfectly intact. Correcting the gap, when it actually matters, doesn't destroy the kindness that came before it. Most of the time, it simply turns a misunderstanding into an actual relationship, built now on something true instead of something assumed, and the jacket, still torn at the cuff, still exactly the same as it was the day she first covered your groceries, never had to change at all for any of it to finally become honest. You're at the same discount grocery store months later, same jacket, same shoes, and a new cashier, young, maybe 19, rings up your groceries and glances, briefly, at the total, then at your jacket, and you can see her doing the same quiet math everyone eventually does, and you let her finish the transaction without correcting anything at all, because the gap here costs nobody anything real. Just a stranger's harmless assumption about a man buying milk and bread on an ordinary Tuesday. You pay, thank her, and walk out to your car, an unremarkable sedan parked next to a Range Rover that belongs, you happen to know, to a man worth roughly a tenth of what you're actually worth, and you think, walking past it, about the specific, strange freedom of a life where almost nobody looking at you from the outside has any idea what's actually true, and how rarely, once you learned which parts of that gap actually mattered, you've ever needed to explain yourself to anyone at all.